Good evening. Welcome. I'm delighted to be here to welcome you to this very important professorial inaugural lecture. We're really delighted that Professor Peter Lavender is going to be speaking to you tonight, and it's delightful to see so many of you here. Now, I usually hand out prizes for the person who's travelled the farthest. I think we know who that person is, and his prize is that his father is Professor Peter Lavender. Welcome, George. You've come all the way from California. Definitely get the prize. Particularly painful as he's leaving tomorrow. But luckily, into a warmer climate. And also, I gather we've got somebody here from Stirling. Is that right? Can we just see who's these? Welcome, congratulations for travelling all the way across the border. Wonderful that you're here, thank you. And I know that you're all here for the same reason as we have Peter here in this faculty, the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing, the University of Wolverhampton, because we wanted to find, we had a very big search out to find an outstanding person who could lead around research, particularly around lifelong learning. And this is something that's very important to us in this faculty and in the university, and we were delighted that Peter applied. And I remember having a pre-conversation with you, Peter. I think you were travelling, you were trained, I was travelling. And he was very humble, but actually we know that that is Peter. He's very humble, but actually if you've seen his CV, as I had to, of course, in order to appoint, we know that he's had tremendous achievements, and he's contributed so much, not only to education, but to society in general. I think many of you will receive the bio, but I'm just going to pick out a few things, and Peter did ask me not to speak too long. I'll try not to do this personally. Actually, he was concerned that we didn't want you to be sitting for too long, so he's thinking of your health and well-being. But in just to pick out a few really important key features, though actually I could be here for some time, Peter, if I was to go through everything. I think the first thing to say really is that Peter was appointed to the university just over a year ago now as Professor of Education in the Faculty of Education, Health and Wellbeing. And as I mentioned already, he was appointed for his general ability and knowledge, and in particular some of the work he's done around further and continuing education. He's been a real asset to us since he's arrived. We got him working straight away, and he's a module leader on our professional doctorate in education. And I've got some colleagues in the room who are also students who are here today, so it's great to see some of our doctoral students here and PhD students as well as researchers. He's also a co-director of one of our research centres, and he is very much the academic coordinator for lifelong learning within the work we do here, but also he works in his spare time, which he doesn't have a lot because we keep him working hard, also works for the Open University still in the role of a supervisor of PhD students, because he formerly worked for the Open University as the coordinator of lifelong learning in that university. But Peter's career has been very diverse, as all good people's, I think, all good academics have a broad experience, and has also worked in what some people like to call the real world, because we think universities are the real world, but in fact he's worked in as a school teacher. He's taught, very importantly, adult learning and reading and writing. He worked as Education Association classes, and he's worked as an education officer for special needs, and that's another area which is very relevant to our faculty and the work we do here. He's also done quite a lot of work around research and developed a number of new ways of thinking, and he's been very much involved in looking at disability in the general sense within education. And those are the things that I think have made his contribution not only to education, but to society as a whole. I think the more recent parts of his CV, he was Deputy Chief Executive for the National Institute of Adult Continuing Education, and he was also the Research Director for that very well-known organisation, which sadly is no more, but did a great deal to take forward adult education and has really progressed this. And I'm not saying RIP, I'm saying it's it's developed and moved on further. Also, he's been interestingly the advisor for the NUS. So we have to make sure we don't get too rebel-like on here. And he's also helped to found the National Society for Apprenticeships, which is another area that we in the university are very interested in. Needless to say, he achieved his OBE, which everyone is aware of, because of his service to education. And he's also been inducted into the International Hall of Fame for Adult and Continuing Education, which was in 2015. I don't think I've ever met anybody who's been in the Hall of Fame.
One or two.
There's one or two here. We'll have to get it together. And two people here. Raise your hands, gentlemen. Thank you. Great, so we are amongst a very, very auspicious audience to this tremendous lecture. And it's very interesting that despite all that, what actually Peter's going to draw on now is his research and his doctorate around the area of adult learning and volunteering, which, as we know, is an area which is really the unsung part that supports much of the work that we do in education. So please would you welcome Professor Peter Lavender, and our consultant.
Thank you very much indeed, Linda, and that was embarrassing but warmly said. Yes, let me start, I think, by thanking you very much indeed for coming. It was a bit of a shock and a surprise when they told me how many were coming, and I rather wished I'd suddenly broken a leg or been taken away somewhere else. Because as those of you who've done it before will know, inaugural lectures are pretty terrifying experiences, and I was reminded of that when one of my family coming in said, "Cool, this is intimate. You could see the whites of their eyes." So there you go, that set me up. I hope this won't be an indulgent ramble. If it does, I can reassure you that it won't last long as it might have done. Some people in my family do go on a bit, given half a chance. It's all in the genes. They've got a lot to put up with. I learned early on that it didn't matter if you were wrong, though. You just had to say things with such certainty that people believe you. And before I begin, I want to thank those who contributed to where I am, really. First, friends who put up with me for going on for years about volunteering. My colleagues who remain welcoming and enthusiastic in spite of everything. And our students, some of whom are here tonight, who are tired of hearing long stories about research. And my family, who are surprised that I'm here at all. I'm blessed in having a family that's got great critical skills, which have been an enormous help to me. They decide which shirt you should wear, what's wrong with your speech, and what you should do about it. But talking of families, I wanted to just introduce you to this little photograph from the family album. Notice the sloped shoulders. This is 1955. I just thought those of you are calculating. Notice the sloped shoulders, going to Sunday school, trudging along, 4 years old, my first experience of organised religion and organised education, and I don't recall volunteering for a single bit of it. Anyway, that I think says a lot, and is it volunteering? I don't know. I don't ever remember agreeing. I want to touch on volunteers and the nature of volunteering in educational contexts. I want to show that they're sometimes recruited out of necessity, but not really welcomed. And I want to touch on how they're perceived in social policy terms. I'll finish with a review of what it might mean for education. What seems like a long time ago now, I worked as an adult education literacy tutor in Bristol for the Workers' Educational Association. The students were almost all men, Some, like the senior caretaker for the Education Authority, had rich life stories which they shared, afterwards writing their autobiographies, which we published. Others were moving from job to job, on building sites or in cafes, wherever they could blag work. All of them unqualified, but very skilled, numerate and canny. Their stories of missed opportunities in schooling, blaming themselves for somehow being missed, intrigued me. But what surprised me most was their lack of anger towards a system that had failed to notice them. It was like a door opening for me, and their experiences made me interested in research. My 3 years as a WA tutor opened 3 other doors. First, one about how adults learned. I discovered the hard way about using the language and the learner's own experiences to make an adult curriculum. But most importantly, and wherever possible, connecting writing and reading, reading the word and the world, as Paulo Freire would have said. The second, a quality door, drew me in as trainer, organiser in literacy work, a researcher and activist in adult education, and an inspector in post-compulsory education. I'd always enjoyed teaching, but adults brought different challenges, and how we could improve the quality of their learning experience intrigued me. The third opportunity, a faded and neglected door on inclusion, was hard to open. In the secondary school I worked in, pupils' lives provided plenty of rich data on which we built individual curricula and reading materials. I was hooked. Later, researching for and advising on Professor John Tomlinson's inquiry into disabled students in FE in the late 90s, I found the concept of inclusive learning provided a revolutionary way of looking at education for students with special educational needs or disabilities. And like many revolutionary things, the concept was simple and powerful. But the fourth door for me was completely unexpected. Through this door stepped an extraordinary range of people who came to me as literacy volunteers. Some of them went on to careers in education and administration, others to work in social care or health. What intrigued me was why. What made them volunteer? What kinds of satisfaction did they get from the experience? If we knew why they volunteered, could we match the motives to the satisfactions, and in that way manage them a great deal better? The volunteers ranged in background and purposes, some politically committed, others just said they wanted to help the campaign. And we trained them in very large numbers and put them to work. We didn't have much option. Thanks to voluntary sector and BBC Energies from 1975 onwards, over 100,000 volunteers came forward across the UK to help. On the Move included film clips every Sunday evening from 1975, with a young Bob Hoskins in the first starring role as lorry driver's mate. At this point, I did think you might want the tune. On the move, one or two of you, older ones, will remember that. The series pushed a strong single phone referral number. The impact was extraordinary and the numbers quite impressive. The assumption was that trained volunteers working with a paid tutor could crack the adult literacy problem, estimated at 2.5 million adults in England and Wales. The latter was a sad underestimate of the challenge. Suddenly, the rather staid world of adult education had new questions. Was it better to learn in groups than on your own? Some education providers matched individual volunteers with adult students and had tuition going on in thousands of front rooms. Could the volunteers be turned into professional educators in 12 hours of training? What kinds of pedagogies work best? What does to be literate mean? It was made clear in many areas that this new educational provision didn't fit the usual models. For example, half the local education authorities in the UK charged a fee for this adult education. Some expected people to stand in line and enrol, and the volunteers weren't like professional tutors. They needed pre-service training and had to be managed. Remedial reading teachers came forward in large numbers. They found evening class earning opportunities, but had to be persuaded away from early years schemes like Royal Road Readers, Janet and John, or Sound Sense. Some of them may be familiar to one or two of you here. By the way, when I arrived in Norfolk to do some work on adult literacy there, I found a new source of income for the adult literacy scheme by selling to schools all of the reading schemes I found on the shelves intended for adults. The volunteers, though, were a fascinating mix of people They were a bit different from volunteers from the volunteer bureaus in the same region. They had a slightly more advantaged education, and for many of them it was their first experience of organised volunteering. I couldn't help noticing that the volunteers made us think differently about adult education and how it should be done, about the nature of shared learning, and about how the teaching of reading and writing should go on. My first group of volunteers included Hannah, a young politics graduate who developed a passion for Paulo Freire's work. She was the one who helped me understand that a language experience approach was not an optional extra in addition to phonics or look and say, but the only approach possible. There was Carol, who said it was a shame that anyone could miss out on reading great literature, and Arthur, who said that anyone who could read had a moral duty to help others who couldn't. The more I asked people why they wanted to help, the more interested I became in the connection between their reasons for volunteering and the satisfactions they received from doing it. Someone said I should stop asking all these questions and do some proper research about it. That's why today I'm not talking about disability, inclusive learning, quality assurance or adult education really, but about volunteering or organised altruism. It became a topic of research I keep returning to, partly because in every corner of education, volunteers can be found. The educational and social benefits need understanding, and volunteers are an attractive idea for policymakers. One of the most interesting things about research is that you find yourself in the most unexpected places. At the University of East Anglia in the 1980s with Lawrence Stenhouse's Centre for Applied Research and Education, I learned what a research community might feel like. For the first time, I found that sharing my curiosity about what made people do things for other people in education wasn't so weird. 4 key themes emerged from my work on volunteers at that time. First, early research work on motivation. Second, the nature of volunteering as citizenship. Third, volunteering as social capital. And lastly, how volunteering had been seized on by governments as a means to an end. My research on volunteers since the 1980s found that they were usually a necessary condition for funding. They were needed to meet the requirements of thousands of adult learners. They brought new people into teaching adults for the first time. But I also noticed that managers found volunteers uncomfortable. For example, few managers appreciated that the volunteers were learners too. Some were suspicious of volunteers without an obvious instrumental reason for volunteering, and they were very keen to screen and train them, to turn them into paraprofessionals. Very little research looked at the experience of volunteers working in education, and even less from a volunteer's perspective. This is curious, since Paulo Freire's work was relatively well known in adult literacy circles. Perhaps we simply missed the fact that volunteer student teachers were central to his strategies in Chile, Nicaragua, Brazil. In a study, the reasons why people volunteer are many and fascinating, as Richard Titmuss in the 1970s observed in his classic study of why people give blood. He found many different reasons for volunteering: a wish to give something back in return for receiving blood, those who thought it improved their health in some way, those who felt that it contributed to making society a better place, and those who were altruists in the purest sense, he said, and a combination of all these reasons. Howard Glenister argues that Titmuss's study still stands today, that a national blood donation service allowed people the choice to give or not to give to unseen strangers. A market in blood, by contrast, would set people free from the conscience of obligation. We do not give up our time to help out in Tesco's, he said, or Barclays Bank out of love or duty, but we do so in large numbers to help at the local hospital and the local school. So be very, very careful with institutions that generate altruism. In a study undertaken more recently into Learning for the Fourth Age, an exceptional charity which matches older people wishing to learn with volunteers who can provide tuition, a volunteer said to me, "My mother was diagnosed with dementia. She was a very creative person, and when she died, I said, right, I want to do something. It connected with my experiences and what I would have liked Mum to have had." Titmuss would have recognised such motivation very clearly. And the topic of motivation lies partly in the moral domain. And so whenever I meet volunteers working in an educational context, I have found some unease from the organisers about discussing motives. It meant that organisers rarely addressed the link between motives and the satisfaction that volunteers had. In fact, when asked about motivation, support or volunteer satisfaction, organisers moved swiftly in their responses to the topic of training, which appeared a safer domain to talk about. As one organiser said, it's very much a two-way thing. We have expectations of volunteers. It's all around the training, expectations and responsibilities of each other. So screening and training often become key issues in relation to volunteers in conversations with organisers. Attention was seldom given to why the volunteers wanted to do this work and why this might matter, other than to weed out unsuitable ones. Given that volunteer satisfaction might be a significant criterion in relation to retention, it was surprising that motivation and satisfaction were seldom linked. Not all reasons for volunteering seemed entirely acceptable. For example, a number of organisers expressed concerns about ulterior motives. I think it's fair to ask why they're doing this. She is an older lady and she's great and wants to give something back and make life better for the future, whereas for the students, there might be an ulterior motive for some of them. It's going to look good on a CV. And from a probation officer interviewed 20 years before, he said, I often don't accept people who say they're doing this to help other people. Altruism, suggests Lawrence Bloom, could be defined as a concern for the weal or woe of another person as a principle of action. I found this definition very helpful. It allows for mutual benefit within altruism and applies to a number of volunteers across the age spectrum. As one volunteer recently told me, I think it's really important to think about the intrinsic value of volunteering and how that might be meaningful, or even in a small way life-changing for the volunteer as much as for the other learner, the resident. So in my case, we're both learners, and we both probably learn as much from each other as, yes, I'm in there to facilitate learning, but it's an even more an egalitarian relationship because I'm learning as well. And a younger one, my own personal experience with family members and stuff, I've always cared for them and stuff like that as well. And I know that other volunteers are doing it for different reasons. I really enjoy things that involve helping other people. I find it really rewarding anyway. So it's just that really when I graduate, I want to do anything with mental health or even with like the elderly or degeneration. Either research on that or just like working with them. So motivations are very complex things. And identifying whether something is purely altruistic or not is a difficult question. For some organisers, the concept of altruism may have overtones of noble self-sacrifice and is treated with some suspicion. Abrams pointed this out in as long ago as 1979. Shades of noblesse oblige, or Lady Bountiful. But Bloom's definition of altruism as concern for the weal of another as a principle of action could be helpful here. Such a shift to different understandings of altruism might assist organisers who have more open discussion with volunteers about why they wish to help and what they would like to get back from helping and what satisfaction they get from the activity. The researcher Philip Abrams in 1970's study of Sunnyside a long time ago suggested that altruism and reciprocity were not distinct but each a form of the other, altruism as reciprocity. Where volunteers' reasons for volunteering were recorded, some kind of check on satisfaction could be feasible. The notion of ulterior motives suggested that some motives were less acceptable than others, though. It's not surprising that some volunteers kept quiet about their reasons for volunteering. They sometimes realised that any suggestion of altruism wasn't worth mentioning. For example, I was told by Janet, a thoughtful young woman in her mid-20s, that her reason for volunteering with primary-age children was probably because they'd be around the same age as the child she herself had given up for adoption when she was 16. When I interviewed the organiser, I was told that no one had been asked what their motives were, but if she were to hazard a guess, she thought Janet was a typical do-gooder. Sometimes it's hard for a researcher to remain impassive in the face of such miscommunication. It was hard to get volunteers to talk openly about why they did what they did, partly because this encourages a judgment by someone else. It was even harder to get education organisers to recognise the relationship between volunteers' reasons and the satisfactions they got from the work. I concluded that this might well be the relative inexperience of the organisers in managing volunteers in an education setting. But it's also, I think, because the primary clients were seen as the students and the volunteers were seen as the means to an end. So it's hard to get anyone to talk openly about motivation. It's important to understand what someone's reasons might be, and we need to understand why there might be misunderstanding about motivation and volunteering. My second theme, closely related to the sense of common weal, is the place of volunteering in citizenship development. Curiously, many studies of citizenship miss some crucial questions about volunteering, why people do it, and what the doing of it means for public policy. My good friend, Professor Bob Fryer, sees volunteering as a key component of citizenship. Referring to the government's 2005 Russell Commission on volunteering, he noted that the report's recommendation was that every UK educational institution should have a volunteering ethos to encourage young people to volunteer while at school, college or university. The notion of volunteering as service being commonplace in education is attractive to governments for several reasons. These instrumental reasons range from the skills of citizenship influence and community empowerment on the one hand, through to filling the gaps in properly funded public services and occupying unemployed people usefully on the other. Volunteering is contentious and political, whichever way you look at it, seen as a force for good by some commentators or a necessary evil by others. It has to be seen with a critical eye. Without such an eye, we're condemned to placing its role in an uncomfortable and often confusing place. It's a contentious and politically charged concept. Volunteering is a core element of citizenship. Its uncomfortable place in the minds of educators can often be explained by this lack of critical appraisal. Governments say that it's clearly a good thing for young people to volunteer. They learn about themselves and other people, about the contribution each individual can make to the well-being of another, and to the place of service in an often self-interested and competitive world. But this requires us to pay closer attention to the place of volunteering, to explore the motivation of organisations and governments in encouraging it, and not to be frightened of debating the issues. In the motive is the answer, I think. A number of policy initiatives in education focus on citizenship. During the Blair government, the school system responded in part to calls for education for democratic citizenship. Bob Fryer offers a number of principles for citizenship, including Principle 7. We should link learning to the possibilities and prospects of increased autonomy for learners and citizens. If we're to see volunteering as part of citizenship, then it might be much easier and more comfortable to see volunteers as co-learners and to their work as making a difference in terms of social capital. Social capital, argued Robert Putnam, was devised as a concept as long ago as 1916 by an education officer, interestingly, called L.J. Hannafin. Hannafin talks about social capital bringing those tangible substances that count for most in the daily lives of people. A social potentiality, he called it, sufficient to the substantial improvement of living conditions in the whole community. Volunteering is a key element of social activity, and it's popular too. A relatively recent survey found that 1 in 4 people in the UK volunteer in a formal way at least once a month, and this trend has remained remarkably constant. Just as many people volunteer informally, this is much harder to measure, and it's dropping slightly, particularly among older people. There is a strong relationship in formal volunteering between gender, age, ethnicity, religion and socio-economic group and propensity to volunteer. Early volunteering among the young is a strong predictor of later volunteering as adults, and volunteering helps you to enhance your social capital. Social networks have great value. Connections between individuals matter. There are norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness which affect the productivity of groups and individuals. In the United States, Putnam found in his study Bowling Alone, published 15 years ago now, that over several decades there had been noticeable declines in church attendance, reducing club membership, charitable giving, dropping union membership, and a general dropping of civic engagement. However, he also found that rising numbers of new national non-profit associations, increasing voluntary activity by younger people, and increased participation in volunteering indicated that social capital wasn't declining, just changing. Although Putnam's work has been criticised as sometimes poor social science, his argument in relation to volunteering has solid value, I think. Putnam argues that the rise in volunteering is particularly prevalent among those born since 1975, not those born since 1945, i.e. volunteering is most evident among young adults, not among baby boomers. This gives Putnam great hope that civic renewal is round the corner in the US. But here in the UK, the data is very different. Our statistics from the National Survey on Volunteering are remarkably stable over time. About 25% of the population volunteer each month. On average, they volunteer 11 hours a month. Education is the commonest field to volunteer in. Raising money is the main purpose, or helping at an event, and women volunteer slightly more than men. People aged 34 to 44, 55 to 64 volunteer more than any other age group. And the commonest reasons for doing it include to improve things, or help people, or having spare time. People volunteer in the main to raise money or to help an event or organisation. In the main, they are those who have had an advantaged education. The higher up the socio-economic grouping you are, the more likely it is that you'll volunteer, except for students, where there's a high propensity, very close to the numbers from managerial and professional occupations, to volunteer. Men and women do volunteer about equally, but for slightly different things, and those in rural areas tend to be more active than those in urban areas. So what is it about volunteering in the UK that makes for an education argument? Well, Putnam argues that generalised reciprocity is so fundamental to civilised life that there is general benefit to all. In particular, he says social capital continues to have powerful effects on education during the college years. Extracurricular activities and involvement in peer social networks are powerful predictors of college dropout rates and college success. Social connectedness boosts educational attainment. His argument is persuasive. The nature of reciprocity, generalised, not necessarily direct, and frequently uncalculated, was explored much earlier and more simply by Richard Titmuss here in England. Titmuss discovered that there were a group of blood donors whose motives could not be truly reciprocal. These donors were a significant minority group who donated blood without any expectation of return of any kind, just because it was a good action to do. There's something of this motive in those who work with volunteers, as volunteers in adult literacy or who offer learning in care homes. Someone I know might do this for the ones I love. But often the reciprocity is not direct but only indirect, what Putnam calls generalised reciprocity. He defines it as, I'll do this for you now without expecting anything immediately in return, and perhaps without even knowing you, confident that down the road you or someone else will return the favour. Understanding this norm of generalised reciprocity is important. I believe that governments frequently misunderstand the nature of volunteering and see it more in transactional terms. If they were to understand generalised reciprocity differently, they might not have made the same kinds of mistakes they have made when it came to the idea of national volunteering for unemployed people. Volunteers and their deployment have been a source of fascination to governments in the past. Whenever a government turns to volunteering as the solution to a social problem, we should all be suspicious. Looking back to the 1980s, the government championed a small government approach, you'll remember, and deliberately celebrated the many roles volunteers undertook. The approach was central to cabinet discussion, and we know this because of leaked documents from the Central Policy Review staff, who have finally closed down for leaking just too much, and from the Number 10 Policy Unit. They tell us just how intense was the hunt for volunteer roles, particularly in respect of those who are unemployed and drawing benefits. It inevitably led to the suggestion of compulsory national community service for unemployed people. And what started as cabinet proposals in the 1980s to enable people to claim benefits while volunteering soon changed entirely to enabling people to claim benefits only if they volunteered, a kind of workfare. From this, it was a simple step for a number of influential groups to argue that we needed to match the jobs that the state could no longer afford to do with the large numbers of unemployed youth who needed to be occupied. Some of you with very long memories will remember some of these debates. The campaign in 1981, spearheaded by Elizabeth Hoodless, who was co-founder of Community Service Volunteers, argued that the government should take the initiative. In the 1980s, Youth Corps and other bodies championed the notion of national community service, matching the number of jobs needing doing with the number of people out of work, and suggesting that unemployed people be asked to volunteer to fill the gaps left by a shortage of teachers, social workers and others. Many different groups connected together voluntary work, unemployment and young people. Youth Corps was the strongest of these, recommended in 1981 more community service for adults, for benefits plus expenses, a compulsory youth training year for all unemployed school leavers, reduced training wages, lower wages for young employees, and entry to the job market raised to the age of 17. All these measures were eventually implemented under the Conservative government to begin with. Margaret Thatcher then asked the Manpower Services Commission to embed such an approach in a programme following riots in 1981. The voluntary project programme became a set of projects, reducing the potentially damaging energies of unemployed young people into a training programme with training allowances. They muddled the notion of volunteers and voluntary organisations along the way. The purpose was worthwhile voluntary work for benefits plus expenses, and it changed the emphasis from benefit to the community to benefit to oneself. The volunteers were the participants. Adult literacy was mentioned as a worthwhile activity for those volunteers. The voluntary project programme is significant in the story for three reasons. First, it paved the way to schemes of training and work for unemployed adults in return for benefits plus expenses or a low allowance, as developed later in employment training and the youth training scheme from 1988 onwards, and in more recent years to many other schemes. Second, the VPP linked for the first time literacy, numeracy, unemployment and volunteering. The link was to be used later in the job training scheme and employment training, and more recently in efforts to reduce the number of adults on incapacity benefit. The Adult Education Service was one of the main targets for the VPP, and the shift from volunteer to trainee was hardly noticed. The third reason for the VPP's importance is that it was an exemplar of social policy ostensibly created for one purpose when in fact other objectives were intended. For example, the announcement by the Prime Minister about VPP was assumed to be in response to the riots, but in fact the Cabinet had already heard in a confidential note from the CPRS that voluntary work was a more justifiable and much more cost-effective measure than support for some of the lame duck industries which consume energy and materials. You can see why they got closed down. Parallel to the government's benefit plus direction, and possibly a strong influence on it, was the pressure at the time for national community service. The national community service debates flourished in the 1980s, firmly linking voluntary work, unemployment, and young people. The claim was that community service, equated with volunteering as seen above, might have 6 benefits. These anything range from reducing alienation to more socially aware citizens. The arguments put forward as to why such a scheme was necessary usually revolved around there being a crisis of care, work that needed to be done in the public sector which could not be afforded, or the need to harness the enthusiasm of altruistic young people. Rarely mentioned were the darker side, high and structural unemployment, or the control of youth behaviours. Arguments against national community service have focused on philosophy, job substitution, finance and allowances, and choice. In addition, voluntary organisations might become more centrally controlled. The state might be able to avoid some responsibility for services, and the concept may lead to unemployed people having to work for their benefits. In the United States, Senator Nunn introduced a bill at the end of the 80s which allowed young people doing voluntary work to earn the equivalent of university fees. Some writers like Slipman and Walker at the time urged that rewards for volunteers doing community service, such as certification and accreditation, were more acceptable to them than altruistic feelings. The fear was that simplistic solutions such as compulsory service for those unemployed and unskilled could damage the positive nature of voluntary involvement. A simple solution was active citizenship. So towards the end of the 1980s, the Conservative government's party conference was dominated by the concept of active citizenship. This appears to be the first explicit central government policy towards volunteering. Home Secretary Douglas Hurd's belief at the time was that neighbourliness would be the political test of the 1990s. He suggested that voluntary work was an obligation of increasing affluence and brought a return to Victorian values and a means of promoting social cohesion. If active citizenship was the linchpin of Margaret Thatcher's Britain, someone said, its significance extends beyond one social policy stream. The roots of active citizenship lie in the Conservative Party's traditional beliefs in service and order, but its use by government ministers at the time had four purposes. It was an attempt to capture the moral high ground. Active citizens are moral citizens, and their work is underpinned by what another Home Office minister described as the moral imperative. Second, government rhetoric favoured underpinning social policy with moral views at the time, based on individual and family responsibility and less state involvement in welfare provision. Third, ideology based on market principles should be applied to the welfare state. And lastly, active citizenship enabled the party at the time to head off any attack on supposed Labour paternalism, the statism of the past. They enjoyed themselves talking about spectres of bureaucracy and insensitivity and the so-called nanny state at the time. Some of these four purposes of active citizenship involve assumptions based on very little apparent evidence. That increased wealth means increased voluntary work, that voluntary workers and voluntary organisations are more effective than professional workers, and that market forces lead to a better and more just society. Other challenges begin with definitions of citizenship. The government at the time attempted to overturn traditional definitions of citizenship based on rights. This market citizenship is another word for volunteering. It omits the essential element of the citizen's rights, unrelated to wealth, class or family background. Meanings change, but active citizenship could not alter the traditional meaning of citizenship as a citizenship of rights unless there was widespread acceptance of the new definition, and there was not. Later, Tony Blair's strong support of the third way and a different form of citizenship took some of these ideas in a slightly different direction. Active citizenship was quietly dropped from policy documents, but replaced a few years later by a slightly different but related concept. When David Cameron said he wanted to see a big society in 2010, he reintroduced Margaret Thatcher's idea of small government, as we all know, with a twist. Cameron didn't need to fund a programme. Gone was the need to create schemes for unemployed young people. They've been effectively removed from the labour market through removing entitlement to benefits, increasing apprenticeships and expecting education providers to make provision. The coalition government, under the heading of Building the Big Society, issued a strong press release in 2010 aimed at encouraging people to take an active role in their communities. It included a range of measures to encourage volunteering and involvement in social action, including launching a national Big Society Day and making regular community involvement a key element of civil service staff appraisals, and of course, a national citizen service. The initial flagship project was to provide a programme for 16-year-olds to give them a chance to develop the skills needed to be active and responsible citizens, mix with people from different backgrounds, and start getting involved in their communities. You've heard this before. It's hard to see that much resulted from this promise. Further education students were encouraged as a kind of work experience to volunteer as part of their FE programme. Their activity costed as part of FE programmes. The National Citizen Service is still active. It takes groups of young people, increasing numbers, hiking and doing voluntary action for a few weeks during school holidays. I suppose although volunteers, coerced or part of a scheme, may not be volunteers in the usual sense of the word, the encouragements through national policy have been consistent through several governments. Colin Rochester recently described this as the dominant paradigm in volunteering, i.e. undertaking unpaid work that needed to be managed and carried out in large, formally structured service-providing agencies. This hasn't gone away with the new government. The current Minister for Skills, Nick Bowles, talks passionately about Cameron's big society and what it means to him, chiefly about localism. He recognises that the big society had been mocked by some people, but if you want to see where the whole concept of the big society is in fact happening, then look no further than the 800 communities in England that are engaged in neighbourhood plans. The Commission on the Big Society, of which the same minister was a member and which reported in 2011, found that 78% of adults and 30% of voluntary sector chief executives were unclear what the phrase big society meant. The Commission rejected the idea of a big society day. What seemed to be the case then is as soon as a government captures the language of voluntary action, the concept gets discredited. As Glenister warned, be very, very careful with institutions that generate altruism. Putnam's prediction that volunteering would increase among the young, especially if they had some involvement in the running of the organisations they were a part of, appears to be true. Numbers of volunteers among the young are increasing both here and in the USA, as are single-issue volunteer organisations. Volunteering as part of social policy will keep coming back as a government theme, but probably not aimed at empowering individuals or enhancing generalised reciprocity or valuing altruism. It's much more likely to be about employability for the young. And there's little sign of encouragement of the kind of voluntary action which Rochester describes as the essence or ideal type of voluntary action, found in the activities and behaviour of unmanaged volunteers within non-bureaucratic organisational settings. Closer to Rochester's ideal type of voluntary action has been some of the rich variety of student voluntary action, recently examined by Georgina Bruis, who notes how under-researched is the place of volunteering, social service and community action in people's lives. Particularly cited is Professor John Field's work on student work camps with unemployed men in the 1930s. In the Learning for the Fourth Age project volunteers' lives were being changed, not because they had to volunteer, but because they chose to. A private contract between themselves as individuals and the voluntary organisation itself. The volunteers suggested the role of co-learner and recognised their work within a norm of generalised reciprocity. To conclude, there is a dynamic energy for voluntary action. People want to do it, and educational activity is a huge beneficiary. An active conversation about reasons for volunteering may well be necessary. Altruism needn't be of concern to organisers of services if they consider that concern for the weal and woe of another as the principle of action is part of the norm. The norm of generalised reciprocity may be a clearer way of seeing the process than the norm of beneficence. In any case, altruism may be a form of reciprocity. Volunteering is a key component of citizenship, and learning citizenship, as Bob Fryer has said, involves linking learning to the possibilities and prospects of increased autonomy for learners and citizens. Governments want to secure support for voluntary action, but policy intentions may not always be clear or do anything more than seek to secure instrumental answers to knotty problems or aim to capture the moral high ground. Government policies can get bent out of shape, as the Voluntary Projects Programme showed, and once a government chooses a new phrase for old purposes, the public and the media seek to discredit it. It was the Commission on Citizenship, as far back as 1989, which recommended that citizenship should be taught in every secondary school, and that all pupils should complete a nationally recognised community service course. The 2005 Green Paper on Youth Matters, followed the Russell Committee's recommendations and proposed providing reward points for volunteering and encouragement for thousands more young people to volunteer. Russell noted that it was not credit young people wanted, but real personal enrichment. The continuous thread from debates about national service from the 1980s until the present time is still sharp, with what seems like a cyclical return to issues of volunteering, young people and citizenship. For those organisers and education providers who might consider introducing volunteers, to work in any education environment, there are some messages. First, the need to recognise that a very particular group of people volunteer, and that this group can be enlarged, but it ought to be valued too. Second, that their motivation for joining in is likely to range from a norm of beneficence right through to generalised reciprocity, and that it's important to establish how such motivation is to be managed. Third, promoting the concept of volunteering and citizenship, active or otherwise, does not alter the fact that successful involvement of volunteers depends not on government exhortation, but on the motivations of individuals and on how much support they receive in their volunteering. Finally, a government's wish to promote volunteering may not be to increase voluntary activity at all, but to justify social policy and claim a moral high ground. So if the focus on volunteering returns again and again in social policy, there must be something in it worth studying. There are probably more research questions we shall need, such as, what's the nature of learning within voluntary action? How can it be valued? How might understanding motivation to volunteer help to understand voluntary action? And what does all this mean for education provision more generally? Volunteers have a significant role in schools, youth work, community development work, and in helping learning happen with adults. And so what voluntary activity means in terms of our current and future communities is a much needed research challenge. What we probably don't require, until we better understand voluntary action, are more national schemes. Thank you.
In this room that stands between you and your invited audience, and the canapes and a glass of something slightly chilled and your opportunity to relax. But just before I let you go, as Professor Lang indicated in her introduction, your contribution to this field has been outstanding, and many learners, colleagues and policymakers will have learnt much from your work. Your lecture is entitled The Gift of Learning, and I'm sure many people here tonight will think that what you've given us is a gift of learning. You've inspired us, and for that we'd just like to give you this very small token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you very much.